This week we finished our series, Fear Not, and I had the opportunity to preach on the women who first arrived at Jesus' empty tomb in Matthew 28. As we discussed, the word for fear is used 4 times in that short passage, but each time the sense of it is a bit different. In fact, we talked about how between the characters in the story, there's sort of progression or an evolution from one kind of fear to another, and finally to courage at the end. It all starts when 2 women, both named Mary, arrive at Jesus' tomb to pay respects. And suddenly there's an earthquake and an angel rolls the stone away from the tomb and sits on it. And then the text says this: "The guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint." So the guards were terrified. Why? Because they didn't know all that was going on. In truth, the greatest event ever to happen had just happened. But they thought that it was something else. They filled the narrative in for themselves. You see, fear is based on our perception of circumstances, which is not always the way things actually are. As we discussed in the sermon, the guards had stage 1 fear, terror. This is the paralyzing kind of fear. It literally says they became like dead people. You see, terror equals fear minus faith. It happens when we have nothing else to turn to but ourselves. That's why the terror mindset is all is lost. Now, perhaps you've been there. You've believed that all is lost. But this passage shows us that we don't have to stay in that stage. The women saw the same event as the guards, but they had a very different perception. They were frightened, but also filled with great joy, and they rushed to give the disciples the angel's message. That's Matthew 28:8. Did you know those 2 emotions could exist at the same time? The women were frightened, but also filled with great joy. The word we have for stage 2 is wonder. Wonder happens when hope is inserted. You see, wonder equals fear plus hope. Not only that, but we learn from the women that the wonder mindset is this: could it be? When the women came to the tomb, they were expecting to see exactly that, a tomb. Instead, they got a message that they were not even hoping for, that Jesus had risen. As a result, they weren't filled with terror, rather they had wonder and awe. I believe that this stage is where we often get stuck, though. God may have been nudging us towards something, giving us hope for some time. However, we stay in the stage of wonder without moving into stage 3, which is courage. You see, the women still had to make a decision after they saw the angel. They were told to go and tell the disciples what they'd seen. This took courage because, remember, women were not regarded as reliable at the time. So it speaks volumes that Jesus chose them to be the first people to proclaim the resurrection. In other words, they were the first people to ever preach the gospel. Now, wonder turns to courage only after a bold step of obedience. Once the women decided to obey God's command through the angel, that is when they finally saw the risen Jesus. Then they got to hear the words from the mouth of Jesus himself: "Do not be afraid." That's why courage equals Jesus over fear. It's also why the courage mindset is, "I will go." When we've met the risen Christ, we have the courage to go and do the things that he told us to do. When we meet the risen Christ, our fear is transformed into courage. Now have a great discussion. Throughout this sermon, I shared the story of how God took me from fear to courage in the call to go plant a church in Des Moines, Iowa next year. I don't really want to dwell on all that because it's kind of sad to think about the fact that my family and I will be moving. However, I hope it can serve as a point of connection for you. But perhaps you're wondering, how do I know if God is calling me to something or if it's just the burrito that I ate for lunch yesterday? And what's the difference between God nudging me in a direction and my own inclinations or my own thoughts? These questions probably require more than just a few minutes in a video. They require close listening and close prayer. But I do think there are a few ways that we can tell if God is calling us to something and we're just too scared, or if it's simply something that we're conjuring up for ourselves. So the first step is prayer. Is it something that you've labored over in prayer? And if that's the case, do you still feel burdened by it? If you haven't really prayed much about it, then you probably shouldn't assume that it's God. Hold that until you've prayed about it to know for sure. Number 2, the church. Have other Christians affirmed it in you? For me and for others I know, we've had moments where other Christians who didn't even know about the question, they come up and tell us or them that they were praying and God impressed it upon them to say something about it. And this can be a huge confirmation. But it isn't just about that. Do other Christians that you respect affirm that calling in you? And finally, number 3, Scripture. Does the Bible affirm this thing that you're feeling called to? The fact is, there are plenty of things that we really don't need to pray about because Scripture simply says to go do them. And when it comes to making a disciple, you're already called. You might need wisdom on some of the finer details, but whether you should do it or not is already clear. However, there have been times where God has placed a Scripture before me that has really affirmed something just when I needed it. I'll go ahead and take some time to go deeper on this topic together.